So welcome everybody to the keynote opening session of MD Lab 2019. I know you're all exhausted. You've been here since 8 a.m., but you look very energetic and ready to hear more discussions on media literacy and this time, media freedoms and social justice. So what we're going to do, I'll introduce our esteemed guests in a moment. I will give each one of them about 10 minutes to discuss this topic. And then we will open it up to Q&A, to questions and answers, okay? So to my left here, Her Excellency Emmanuelle Lamoureux. Well done. It took me like 15 minutes to try it. Ambassador of Canada in Lebanon. She joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 2002. She also worked at the United Nations Affairs Division and was Deputy Director responsible for media relations and Deputy Director responsible for communication in Afghanistan, in the Afghanistan Task Force. So she's one of us, studied communication at university too. Also His Excellency Rampling is the British Ambassador to Lebanon. Prior to him being ambassador, he was the UK permanent representative to the EU's Political and Security Committee and Foreign, Defense and Development Counselor. That's a huge role. I don't know the details of that work. He is also a Middle East expert with the previous postings as Deputy Head of Mission in Amman, and I just told them under the mic we have a large number of participants from Jordan here. We also have Ayman Mhanna, Executive Director of the Samir Foundation, and an advocate of freedom of expression, and an activist and a friend to LAU and to myself. He led the team that also launched the Media Ownership Monitor in Lebanon in collaboration with Reporters Without Borders. Ayman previously worked at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. So we're going to be talking today and having a lot of discussions around the topics of media freedoms and social justice. And we spoke a lot about social justice at the beginning today and the role of media literacy in advancing these matters. So if you don't mind, may I start with you telling us about this topic?
Is it working?
I think so. Yeah, it is.
You can hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yes. Old technology for me, as you can see. Forgive me, I studied journalism at a time when preparing a radio report involved the use of razor blades to cut the tape. So I'm very comfortable with this old microphone. Very pleased to be here today, of course, alongside my British counterpart for the launch of the 2019 edition of LAU's Media and Digital Literacy Academy in Beirut. Digital literacy is extremely important at a time when we see a crackdown on press freedom. I'm sure you've had the chance to discuss the recent events earlier today during the lab per se. And so we view these efforts as essential. Today is an opportunity to reflect, of course, on the important role of a free press in defending human rights, inclusion, and diversity, and holding the powerful to account as well, and demanding transparency from governments, and in protecting the rule of law and strengthening democracy. Freedom of the press and freedom of expression is, of course, enshrined in a variety of international texts. It is in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's reaffirmed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we, as a country, Canada, believe very strongly that freedom of media and expression is a cornerstone of democratic societies and essential for the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It is, as I mentioned earlier, at risk at the moment. You probably know a lot of the stats. Some of you work as journalists. Others are getting ready to work as journalists. Those stats are alarming. I think it's 54 journalists who were killed in 2018 in the exercise of their work, and over 250 journalists imprisoned, also because of the work they do. We know that several of them actually most of those were imprisoned in Turkey, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. But in fact, this phenomenon that we're talking about affects all parts of the world. It is not a phenomenon that is specific to one region in the world. We're seeing this regression everywhere. Without being complacent, of course, we can rejoice in the fact that here in Lebanon, we see, very respectable levels of freedom of expression, press freedom. It can be viewed in many ways as a model for the region. But we also have to take into consideration the fact that the media landscape is changing, and changing very fast. And I'm referring, of course, to social media. And that's why when we talk about freedom of expression and the right of citizens to be informed, I think it's important as well to consider the duties that come with that freedom. And those duties are increasingly important. The first one I would say, and it applies to many of you in this room, is the duty of journalists to produce high-quality information for people. And that means, of course, respecting ethical guidelines, verifying, the information that you put out there. It means, of course, diversity of your sources. I like to play this game of checking when I read an article, who are the sources? How many women? How many men? How many young people? How many older people? Are the main stakeholders being interviewed? How often do we see an article about a specific group of people? No one has bothered to interview those people. So that's the first duty. The second duty, I would say, is the duty of citizens, and that's very much about media literacy. I think we live in a world where we all have to be very conscious of what information we're taking in and using to make our daily decisions. I had a professor back in university when I was studying journalism who used to tell me, and I found out later actually that he was Lebanese. I didn't know that at the time. He was just my professor. He used to tell us, we were 18, 20 at the time, read everything. Read absolutely everything, especially what you disagree with. There is a real risk with social media to get caught in the echo chamber. We can absorb information that is tailored to our set of beliefs, to our values, and we can also not look outside. What's out there? What are the viewpoints of people who don't necessarily think like us? And this happens without us even noticing at times. You're maybe an environmentalist. Well, you subscribe to the feed of Greta Thunberg and of Greenpeace and of a range of people, and then you never hear the viewpoint of people who maybe disagree with them. Regardless of who's right and who's wrong, it is essential, especially if you are an information professional, to read absolutely everything. And the third duty has to do with hate speech. Freedom of expression should know literally or almost no boundaries. But where I think we have to draw a red line is when it comes to incitement to hate. We cannot forget that the ultimate goal of freedom of expression is well-informed citizens who are able to contribute and participate in our societies. And in order to do that, if the information they're fed actively incites hate against a specific group, there is a real risk there. Now, it is important to define hate speech narrowly and to think long and hard about what it is we mean by incitement to hate, because there is, of course, it can be a very, very slippery slope, So this is, a discussion that needs to happen, as a society. We all need to think, okay, where do we draw the red line between freedom of expression and, and hate speech? But at the same time, we do need to protect the most vulnerable elements of our society against a discourse that could essentially put them at risk, and including getting some of them killed. So those are the duties that come, from my perspective, with the right to be informed, the right to access, high-quality information. Now, to further advance this commitment to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, we have partnered, as you know, Canada has partnered with the UK. Our two foreign ministers are strong defenders of freedom of expression. In fact, Minister Freeland is herself a former journalist. They have partnered together on a very exciting initiative, which is the hosting of a Media Freedom Conference to occur next month in London on July 10th and 11th. And the objective is really to find ways to combat disinformation, support and defend media against censorship, imprisonment, personal attacks, abuse. It will bring together not only governments, but also journalists, civil society organizations, other stakeholders, to discuss effective ways of addressing emerging threats to media freedom, including safety of journalists and disinformation. We believe as Canada that the media play an essential role in defending and advancing the truth. Journalists must absolutely be allowed to report facts freely and independently. And so we hope that the conference in July, as well as fora similar to the one we're attending today, will help to find common ground among states in addressing challenges to the integrity of the global information space and bring us a step closer to our objective, which is a free and independent press, which enables citizens to be well informed and participate actively in their societies. So on this note, I'll just not pass the mic to Chris. I think you have your own mic.
Yep, that's perfect. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and Emmanuelle has covered a great amount of what I was going to say, but that just goes to show the partnership that we have here. But I'll add a couple of things, both generically on the importance of this subject, which I think in some ways doesn't need repeating, but I think it always needs repeating, particularly in this world. And then just a couple of quick words about the specific subject on the table today, the importance of media and digital literacy, and then look forward to the questions. So, I mean, first of all, I do think this is an extremely important issue. I'll come to kind of what we're doing about it in a second. But freedom of expression clearly is a basic human right. But much more importantly than that, in this part of the world, it's not only a question of rights, it's also a question of productive societies and flourishing societies. And there is no doubt, both in my mind but empirically, that the free press and the possibility to get stories out there, to hold people to account, and to strive for truth, that underpins successful developing economies and societies. We obviously, and we can unpack some of this through the questions and elsewhere, and Emmanuelle has touched on it, we are in a world of distorted truths, disrupted facts. You can call it fake news if you want, but I think actually, almost more damaging than fake news is twisted news, actually. And we're in a situation where there is much more opinion out there than there used to be. So the question of what is trusted is really more fundamental, arguably, than it's ever been before. At the same time, as Emmanuelle has talked about, we're living in a world where journalists are facing increasing harassment. There's some terrible numbers out there, and obviously there are particularly terrible parts of the world like Syria and other places, but including in the UK, we recently witnessed the shooting, the tragic murder of a lady called Melki, who was reporting on a protest, and she was shot while there in Northern Ireland. These people and many of you, risk your lives to bring the news and to bring the real stories to life. I was at just this week, maybe others of you know about the festival, the Almost There Festival, which is a film festival that's taking place here.
Sorry, just so that the translators can hear. Can you bring the mic a little bit closer? Just bend it a little. That's perfect.
How's that? Is that any better? Yeah.
That's better.
Sounds like
Is that better?
Okay. For all the guys at the back and at the top.
Okay,
but there was a very shocking and moving film, Majanin fi Halab, Madness in Aleppo, and it just demonstrates there was a guy who had taken a camera into the hospital in Aleppo day after day as it was being shelled. The bravery, the commitment to bring those stories out. It's a complicated situation, but just commitment to actually make sure that those stories were seeing the light of day was extremely important. And that, as Emmanuelle has said, is why our foreign ministers have come together, why our governments have come together to launch a campaign to defend free media around the world. That is going to be an important conference. It's not that the conference is the end of the game. In fact, what it's really designed to do is to get together a stronger global alliance on this issue, and also to look at different means. One of the things that we're particularly pleased is that obviously there's a British Lebanese, Melki, who is going to be both the UK's Special Envoy on media freedom, but she's also going to chair the panel at that conference, which will take together many of the world's best legal minds to develop and promote legal mechanisms to prevent and reverse the abuses. So, I mean, I think I won't say all that much more, except that specifically on the question of the importance of media and digital literacy, I mean, look, this is crucially important and arguably is more important than ever before. We have a perverse effect that with the increasing freedom, with the increasing space out there for people to put out their stories, it's made the job actually of investigative and challenging journalism that much more difficult. With the increased access, it means that the important stories are both hidden, but also that it seems to be easier for people to throw smoke in the way and to obfuscate the situation. The real truth has been lost. And just as one small example, I was in Brussels for 4 years, most recently, in that difficult-to-pronounce job title that you were trying to wrestle with. And I was there when MH17, the flight, was shot down over eastern Ukraine. And in the discussions we were having in the European Union, actually most people by and large got the idea that it was almost certainly a Russian system that had brought that down. But the Russians were out there straight away saying that it wasn't them, saying that it was someone else, saying that it was the Ukrainian army. This was something that we had to wrestle with to some extent, but even with some of the most obvious elements, some of the most obvious facts, people are out there trying to challenge those. So I think understanding not only what it is that we want to convey, what it is that our audience need, but also the how is incredibly important. And if there's one thing that I think we in the British system have got better at recently, it's understanding and producing good content that has impact and that is short. And that is such a challenge. I mean, presumably from the time, Emmanuelle, you were a journalist, you had more space, if you like. Now you have to grab people's attention so quickly. And that is something that I'm sure you'll both be wrestling with, but that will become even starker over the coming period. So I think this is an incredibly important issue, and thanks very much for hosting us today.
Thank you. The ambassadors mentioned that the situation in Lebanon is slightly better than other countries in the region. We also cover Syria, Jordan, and Palestine, and we have good contacts in Iraq and other places. So the examples that I will give in a bit from Lebanon are, of course, amplified in our neighbor countries. But if the situation is that bad in Lebanon, you can imagine the trend in the region in general. I'm also putting the timer on to make sure I don't exceed it. So Lebanon, as I mentioned, is facing today one of the most challenging periods for freedom of expression in general, media freedom in particular. And the number of violations that we have recorded at the Samir Kassir Foundation's Sky Center since January 2018 up to this day are really worrying. Quickly, 34 journalists, artists, human rights defenders, and activists summoned before the various security agencies, whether the police, the Cybercrime Bureau, the state security, general security, etc. 32 judiciary actions against journalists, human rights defenders, and activists based on very erratic and inconsistent interpretations of libel, slander, and defamation provisions in our laws. 18 cases of censorship targeting movies, theater plays, public events, books, magazines, websites. 15 cases of detention of journalists for more than 24 hours, human rights defenders, and activists because of the same vague definition of the terms I just mentioned earlier. 7 journalists physically assaulted by either security forces or non-state actors because of their coverage or their opinions. 5 prison sentences against journalists in Lebanon. The first prison sentences in more than a decade. 4 journalists and artists banned from entering Lebanon. 3 media offices attacked by political party militants or stormed by security institutions. While these numbers are important, our role is to understand the underlying conditions that have made them possible. And it's not only Lebanon. It's a global challenge. You very clearly mentioned it. And I can highlight 5 types of challenges that media freedom is confronted to locally but also globally. First challenge is the challenge of impunity. 24 journalists were killed or murdered since Lebanon's independence in Lebanon. 12 out of 24 were killed after the end of the Lebanese Civil War in 1990. In all these 24 cases, only one person, the person who shot the bullet at Kamel Mroué, the founder of Al Hayat and the Daily Star in 1966, was arrested. That's it. And we're not only talking about journalists who are killed, but we're also talking about hundreds of cases of physical assaults on journalists by security officials, but also by non-state actors that are filmed, that are on tape, so we know exactly who beat whom. Not any single case of police or judiciary action against any perpetrator of attacks against journalists. But globally, the situation is not that brighter. No less than 55 killings of journalists last year, probably around 99 if we also include media activists around the world, and proper action has only been taken in less than 10% of the cases. When it comes to the EU over the last 3 years, assassinations and murders of journalists, of course in Northern Ireland, unfortunately very recently, but also in Malta, Slovakia, and Bulgaria. In 50% of the cases, so you can do the math, we haven't really seen strong government commitment to actually shedding the light on what happened. Second challenge is the legal environment. Lebanese legislation is full of vague expressions, not only libel and slander, but also preserving national security, coexistence, inciting sectarian strife, harming Lebanon's relations with friendly countries, but usually it's not Canada and the UK, disrespecting the presidency. So these very elastic expressions are interpreted differently from a presidential mandate to another, from who is in power to another, and by pure chance, never does any member of a party that is a strong party represented in government, strong sectarian party represented in government, ever threatened of judiciary action based on these. By pure chance, it's always the independent, non-aligned people who face the legal troubles because of these words. And this challenge is also amplified by the fact that we don't really have, unfortunately, a truly independent judiciary branch. Judges, even when no pressure is exerted on them, need to take into account the balance of power. Who's really strong these days in government? Because they need government appointment to get promoted to better positions. So even in the absence of any pressure, the mere fact that there is no judiciary independence in terms of nominations and promotions make judges quite... they would take into account, let's say, who's in power and who's strong today in their decisions. Third challenge is the challenge, and you mentioned it very well, of digital transformation. Today, the whole issue of how we can be free in an era where government agencies and private companies know more about ourselves than ourselves and our families because of the collection of data, and how much that collection of data can affect our privacy. Therefore, our freedom is very strong. And it's not only a Lebanese challenge, although Lebanon is really, really doing badly on that front, because we do not have any clear legal framework that defines what can be done with our data, who can collect what, for how long, how is it stored, are the servers where it's stored secure or not, what is our cybercrime bureau allowed to do, in which cases we can use the data, which other cases do not necessarily open the door for data use, how to protect the sources for journalists. Are insurance companies allowed to decide my premium based on the Instagram pictures of food I post or not? Complete gray zone, no idea whatsoever. So you can imagine the abuse. And we did have abuse. 2 of the worst scandals took place in Lebanon over the last 2 years. First one is the dark Caracals scandal, and you can check it. It's massive espionage on our phones, on your phones, I mean, maybe not yours, but on diplomats and on civil society activists and on lawyers that was collected through an unprotected Wi-Fi system related to the general security building. Whether the general security was involved or not remains a big question mark. Also the Ziad Aitani case, where a security agency fabricated false data to incriminate someone because of personal vendetta. Regardless of the details, the fact that no coverage, no real substantial technical coverage of what these cases mean, and no accountability whatsoever to whoever was responsible of this shows how bad the digital challenge is. In the economic challenge, media cannot be truly free if it's not truly independent. So as long as there is no transparency over who owns, who funds the media, and this is the kind of effort we did through the Media Ownership Monitor to understand who truly owns the top 40 media outlets of Lebanon, we will face a real struggle. But the real issue here is the fact that whether in Lebanon or elsewhere, we haven't really found the right business model for independent media. Media outlets in Lebanon have been closing, whether As-Safir, Al-Mustaqbal, Al-Ittihad, Al-Balad, Al-Anwar, you name it. And people working in media outlets in Lebanon know that they are very lucky if their salary is only 3 months late. So that situation creates lack of independence because people do not want to harm the interest of their donor, their backer, their big boss. Therefore, there are real pressure on their freedom of expression. And the issue of business model is not only Lebanese, as you know. It's difficult to sustain a media outlet today all over the world because of the digital transformation, because of competition from social media. But there are very creative examples that are using new technologies that are better understanding how people read the news and consume the news in order to find these solutions. We in the region need to be part of that discussion. How the nerds, probably us, the geeks who work in the tech field, and the investors can sit together around one table and come up with creative solutions around it. But you guys have also some responsibility. The media development commitment is still relatively low. According to a study by the National Endowment for Democracy in 2015, only $50 million a year were dedicated to media development, and out of which only 0.6% would go to media and digital literacy. In a world where state television of Belarus, like a small country but not necessarily a very democratic one, has a budget of 30 million. Belarus alone, state TV, 30 million. Media development commitment globally in 2015, 50 million alone. So I think much more needs to be done in order to walk the talk. And the last challenge I will mention is the political challenge. Freedom of expression is being discussed today in a political climate polluted by disinformation, and you mentioned that. Today, dozens of calls for proposals are launched to fund media and information literacy campaigns against fake news, studies to understand how disinformation spreads. These projects are absolutely necessary, but they will not attain their goal if the adequate resources are not put on the table. So that 0.6% of 50 million need to increase, and the 50 million need to increase. The technological response has to happen. We need to be able to engage with the big tech firms and put them before their societal responsibilities. It is not acceptable to hear that algorithms decide. Well, car companies resisted the introduction of seatbelts, and they resisted the introduction of better emission rates for gas emissions. Tobacco companies also resisted smoking bans. Today, the big tech firms are resisting interference in their algorithms. Well, these algorithms are keeping us in the echo chambers that Ambassador Rampling mentioned, and they are allowing the spread of fake news. If we don't have that serious discussion with them as a societal public safety responsibility, let's not wait for casualties to wake up. And finally, a political response. Identity-based politics, fear-based politics, strong men-based politics, spreading so fast across the world, from the US to Brazil, to Turkey and Hungary and Italy and the Philippines, is a perfect environment for that to fail. When someone says that the media is the enemy of the people on one spot of the world, this can have criminal consequences on that other part of the world. So the London conference, which I am very happy to attend in July, not only should echo that message that humanist values protect freedom of expression when they are in power. This is great. We need to echo that message. But if a few months afterwards, parties who do not believe in these values end up winning elections in countries that are supposed to champion what we're calling for right now, will be in a deeper challenge. So that's why the political responsibility lies upon everyone, including voters. Thank you.
Is it off? No, it's on. Thank you very much, everybody. So I'm going to open it up for questions. You can ask in English or Hello? اللي بيسأل بالعربي بس بالميكروفون بليز نقدر نحصل على الترجمة. Anyone would like to go first? All right, well, I will start with a question. Ambassador Lamoureux, you mentioned
right here.
when you read an article, you look for sources. And most of the sources, usually, whether it's in an article or in any kind of media, you see a lot of voices not represented, symbolically annihilated in theoretical terms. My question is to you, and I was reading this about the Canadian government. Canada makes a historic investment to promote health and rights of women and girls around the world. Maybe I should use this? Hello? All right. All technology. We might go into screaming in a little bit, but so I'll repeat what I read. Canada makes historic investment to promote the health and rights of women and girls around the world. And I think the investment is something around like $1.5 billion. 1.4 Canadian dollars. Okay. Is that higher or lower than that?
That's like 1.1 billion US dollars. That's
It's
great.
more than the 50.
Way more than the 50 million for media development.
Is there anything in that for media literacy? Is there anything in that for media development? Is there anything in that for media freedoms?
All right.
There you go.
I wouldn't be able to answer at this stage because the announcement was just made. But what I want to say is that another announcement was also made at the same conference, which is Women Deliver, which took place in Vancouver earlier this month. And that was an announcement of $300 million. And the target in this case is specifically women's organizations.
Okay.
And so I think, I don't know what parameters are going to be used to determine how those various pots of money are going to be allocated. What I do know is that the initial large amount that you mentioned is really going to focus on health, like specifically sexual health and nutrition. The other amount that I mentioned is going to women's organizations. So, it could well be that some of it is going to be allocated towards organizations that work on those issues. But at this stage, it's too early to tell, quite frankly. But what I do want to say, specifically on the issue of gender equality, there has been recently a conscious effort by some journalists to balance their sources, to basically look at who it is they go to report on specific topics, be it oil and gas, the economy, political life, sports, whatever it is, name it. And to rebalance a little bit their Rolodex, say, oh, how many women do I have, among my sources? And to start looking into, well, first of all, how do I expand the number, like the diversity of my contact network so that I don't always go to the same voices and the same people? And how does that change the story? Because it does change the story when you ask different people. So I think this is something, and a lot of people will say, oh, no, there are no experts really on those issues. All experts on this topic happen to be men, and so be it, and we have to live with that. Well, I would say this is laziness. I think it's basically, it means that your network is not good enough, and it's important to expand the voices that are, made public and projected. And this is not just for men versus women. I think it's in general, looking at the voices we amplify. It's extremely, extremely important. So I didn't specifically address your question because I don't have the answer, but I think in general, it's definitely an area where we need to work more at governments and journalists to make sure that our stories and the stories that make it out there are more balanced and reflect the variety of views that exist in society.
Definitely, thanks. And that's what I wanted to get to. And I know you're going to come on Friday to attend the panel on media minorities and the marginalized. which addresses many of these issues.
Yeah, and I promised to do my homework before then, but the Women Deliver conference specifically was on women's health and reproductive rights. So it's not exactly the right fit for this.
Okay. Ambassador Rampling, we've often looked towards Canada, the US, and the UK and the history of teaching media literacy and teaching digital literacy. And I remember in the 80s and 90s, I believe at high school, in many schools in the UK, media literacy was widespread and taught to in the majority of schools, if I remember correctly. Is that still the case? Because lately I've been hearing that there's a little bit of backlash against media literacy, especially after Brexit, especially after what has been happening. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of the UK, not only internally but also externally, in pushing for media literacy around the world, and specifically within the realm of social justice?
Happily. Can you hear me? Is that better? No, yeah. I mean, happily, and I don't, at the risk of sounding challenging, I don't recognise the picture that you conveyed, and certainly not as a result of anything else that's happening with the UK at the moment. I think, honestly, this is an issue that both our practitioners but also our educational establishments are taking increasingly seriously. And I think we have outstanding both journalism courses per se, but also that do the different elements of it. And that's the case both in terms of higher education, and I know I've plenty of examples of people who've gone to the UK in order to study it, but I think it's also the case in terms of some of our fantastic organisations who help to do the work overseas. So just as one example, and I know quite a lot about it because my wife has spent a lot of time working for them, we have an organisation called the BBC World Service Trust, now called BBC Media Action, that does exactly this stuff, be it in Afghanistan, be it around here, be it in North Africa, be it in Africa, all over the world. And that gets contracts with DFID in particular, but not only, with the European Union through the Madad Fund, and it helps to take, kind of, if you like, BBC expertise and to show that. So that's just one example. But I think this point that was being talked about by Ayman around the importance of investment and of money. We have a department for culture, media and sport, and we will have a spending review over the next couple of years, which is the way that we look again at how we apportion money. And I would expect them to be making the case for more to be flowing into this area because it's sufficiently important. And the other thing to say, just on a local level, we're also doing some work. We did some with Ayman and Skies and Maharat to build up the capability and the capacity of journalists here, and in particular looking at platforms. So that's something that we will continue to do.
And by the way, you referred to, you can find anything on the internet. I discovered recently that there's a group of flat earth conspiracy theorists who are quite widespread with thousands of supporters around the world. There was a Netflix episode on it. It's hollow. I don't know. Ayman, you mentioned it's important to know who owns what, who owns the media. And thank you for giving us a bad rap in Lebanon. We usually are proud in front of our Arab brethren and sisters about our freedom of expression and freedom of the presses. But it's a reality also that we face all these problems in Lebanon too. Can you tell us a little bit about what your organization is doing with Reporters Without Borders when it comes to media ownership?
Sure. So the Samir Kassir Foundation was created after Samir Kassir's assassination in 2005, and we are mainly about media freedom and quality of information. So in addition to monitoring the violations that target journalists, media professionals, artists in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine, we really believe that we need always evidence-based data in order to advance our case, in order to advocate. And one of the areas that haven't necessarily been covered sufficiently is who owns the media. Because in Lebanon, and it's the case all over the Arab world, you usually have to justify everything you say, or actually you think that you have the information by just repeating the idiom, everybody knows. But everybody knows is never a strong enough piece of evidence in order to move forward. This is why we really wanted to look into the books, the commercial registry at the Ministry of Justice, but also all the announcements made in the media through open source intelligence, but also through direct meetings with staff and directors at different media outlets. We took the top 40 local media outlets, which means, for example, in TV, LBCI, MTV, Future, OTV, Al-Manar, Télé Liban, NBN, Télé Lumière, and Al Jadid. We did not include, for example, Al Mayadeen or others that are based in Lebanon, but that have a regional focus. Same for the top 10 newspapers, actually only 8 are still existing, top 10 radios and top 10 websites based on viewership and audience data. And we opened their books, asked them to open their books to see if they were ready to be transparent, or we directly went to the Ministry of Justice to check who owns them on paper.
How many of them opened their books?
Fully 3 out of 38, and responded to our request 7 out of 38. And we looked into the names of the owners, but then started to draw the parallels. So basically you have one company that owns 10% of LBCI, and if you look at who owns that company, it's exactly the people who own 50% of LBCI, so on and so forth. If you take the Daily Star, for example, a newspaper that was founded, as I mentioned, by Kamel Mrouwa. Malik Mrouwa, chairman of the Daily Star, is also the vice president of our organization. He owns 0.007% because they sold everything, and he is open about it. There is no secret to the Hariri family. But in fact, if we look into the books, we see that those who own 99.9 something percent is a holding company that is owned by another holding company that is owned, like there are 5 layers of holding companies to reach the last holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. You have other newspapers, for example, Al-Akhbar, that is owned by its own editor-in-chief and someone that is completely absent from any kind of public record. His name is Mr. Youssef Wehbi, but which Youssef Wehbi? No answer at all. And then you will also see that their former executive director still holds a small piece of the shareholding, of the shares. When we asked her about it, she said, it was just the facade for the small investment that former Prime Minister Najib Mikati made in Al-Akhbar. I don't really own anything, it's his money. So this kind of information that was always backed by evidence, where we got our information from, is on mom.skiesmedia.org, and we did not come up with any recommendation. Our point is, let's make the information public, and we hope to be wrong about some of them, because it means that the media outlet have either not respected the law by not revealing their data to the Ministry of Justice, or we're very happy to update our website if they actually open up and tell us what the correct information is. So this is just one example with the idea that when you know who the media outlet works for, who funds it, who owns it, it's part of media literacy in a way. It helps us better interpret and understand what's presented.
It's definitely one of the core lectures that we teach in media literacy, and I hope everybody will be able to use it. And more Arab countries are going to be
Yes, I think it's included. Other Arab countries are included. Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt have their pages on it. And in the region, we also have Turkey. Unfortunately, the German Ministry for Cooperation has stopped the funding of that project, not only for us, but for Reporters Without Borders generally, and there are a lot of efforts being done right now to keep it alive, to keep updating it. As an organization, just for the Lebanon chapter, we're committed to keeping it updated and updating it basically twice a year. So check it.
Well, thank you for your efforts. What questions do we have? Okay, let's start with Ismail.
السلام عربي لأنه حكي كتير أوكي تمام. السلام عليكم، أنا إسماعيل أبو شخيدم، إعلامي من الأردن. سؤالي للسيد رامبلينج في خصوص التربية الإعلامية ودعمها. بس أول شيء أنا حابب أذكر بشغلتين. في الحرب العالمية الأولى كان في مكتب للإعلام يدعم في أمريكا، يحاول يعلن بشكل غير مباشر عشان يخلي الشعب الأمريكي يدعم أمريكا، أو الشعب الأمريكي يدعم بريطانيا في الحرب العالمية الأولى. وبرضه في الحرب العالمية الثانية البي بي سي كانت تقول الحقيقة ولكن ليس كل الحقيقة، وهذا ساعد في انتصار بريطانيا في الحرب العالمية الثانية. هلا دعم بريطانيا للتربية الإعلامية هل سيؤدي إلى ضرر على بريطانيا خصوصا بعد خروجها من البريكزيت ووصول المعرفة للجميع، خصوصا إذا صار في حرب على بريطانيا بدون الدعم الأوروبي عليها؟ شكرا.
Should we take just one question, or should I answer this? I mean, thanks for the history. Fundamentally, we're not scared of this. So the reason we support media freedom and all of the kind of literacy tools that sit behind it in the way that we've just been talking about is not only because it's important to get the truth out there, but also fundamentally because we think this is a really, really important part of the right, of developing the right kind of societies out there. If people, as a result of this, start to criticize the UK, well, you know, I mean, I've been in this region for quite a long time. I don't suddenly think that we're going to have criticism where we didn't have criticism before. You know, truth, an honest debate, having the right kind of conversations, that is absolutely at the cornerstone of development in this part of the world, and I want to be having those discussions. And if that means that sometimes I think that we may have got it wrong, or we think that we may have got it wrong, then absolutely fantastic, and we'd be delighted to have that. I mean, I think this comes to the heart of what I think is a very strong tradition in my country and in Emmanuelle's country, which is of not only having, if you like, freedom of expression, but also of having a free and challenging press. And I think no one could say, including in the spirit of Brexit, no one could say for a second that we have therefore been stifling views. So I'm very comfortable with this, and we will continue to be pushing it. And once again, that's why our ministers are pushing it so hard.
Another question? Can we have one from here?
السلام عليكم، سيف الدين من العراق. سؤالي لسعادة السفيرة الكندية، كيف تفسرين موقف كندا فيما يتعلق بدعم منظمات أو جهات يعني تدعي سؤال لسعادة السفيرة الكندية، كيف تفسرين موقف كندا فيما يتعلق بدعم منظمات أو جهات تدعي أنها تناصر حقوق المرأة لا سيما في العالم العربي، حيث أنه ما جرى للفتاة السعودية رافل القنون يعني يعتقد البعض أنه هذا يضرب بنية المجتمع وهي الأسرة. نحن كأكاديميين وكتدريسين يعني سوقنا الحادثة على أنها هي اعتداء على بنية المجتمع، وحذرنا من هذا الفعل. في حين يعني كيف أنه السلطات الكندية أو المعنيين في كندا كيف سوقوا هذه الحادثة في مجال التربية الإعلامية، يعني كيف قدموا هذه الحادثة والصورة مثلا الطلبة في المدارس والكليات.
شو اسمه اللي اعتدوا عليها؟
مش اعتدوا.
لا يعني فيما يتعلق في حادثة الفتاة السعودية رافل القنون اللي تبنتها السلطات الكندية.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So, if I understand the question right, you're asking about the coverage of the story of the young Saudi woman Rahaf Mohammed, who left Saudi Arabia and came to Canada as a refugee. I mean, first of all, Ms. Mohammed is not, of course, the first person that Canada hosts who fears for her life. You know, it's part of a long humanitarian tradition, Canadian tradition of hosting people who fear for their lives. We've, hosted journalists, members of the LGBTQ community, some women as well who were at risk, human rights activists. So this was part of a much broader effort. Of course, this is a case which received a lot of coverage because it happened at a time where there had been, other incidents in our bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia that had, created a strain in our relationship. And I think a lot of the interest from the media was in that context, in the context where the relationship was already a little bit bruised, unfortunately. And I don't think that was ever the intention of the government, to end up with such a difficult relationship. But in the end, they decided to host Mrs. Mohammed, who now lives in Canada. But I just want to emphasize the fact that she's not a unique case. She's just a case that has received, indeed, a lot of media attention. Canada hosts every year 300,000 new Canadians. And of those, a significant number are refugees, so people fear for their lives. So it just so happens that Ms. Mohammed's case received a lot of attention, but as you might have noticed, shortly after the incident, I think she wanted to live her life in Canada, resume her life normally, and the media attention has decreased substantially. I think people were able to understand that, as a young 18-year-old woman, she needed a private life in order to start her life anew in a context that we can imagine is not easy. So the media attention has decreased substantially. But yes, at the time, of course, it was widely covered. I mean, the social media were going wild, as I'm sure you all recall, a lot of, networks were retweeting her tweets. She was getting a lot of attention. And at the time when Canada made the decision to host her as a refugee, she was already known across the world. So that's all I can. Does that address the question? Because I didn't hear the translation. If not, I'm happy to take it.
كيف سوقت كندا هذه الحادثة ضمن مناهج التربية؟ نحن في منهج التربية الإعلامية اعتبرناها أنها تدخل في حقوق الآخرين وفي خصوصيات المجتمعات. اعتبرتها أني تدخل في شؤون المجتمع. باعتبار أنه مسألة تنميط أو استغلال المرأة ومن القبيل.
How does...
Or included, yeah.
If her case was used in media literacy lessons in Canada, I think maybe the story is a bit too recent to use it specific. Okay, I address that. Thanks.
شكرا لكم. أنا كنت بدي أسأل سؤال بس زميلي دخل بسؤال يعني تقريبا نفس الشيء، إنه إحنا دائما سؤال للسيد أيمن مهنا، إنه دائما إحنا بننادي بحرية التعبير وحرية الصحافة، كيف نقدر نميز بين حرية التعبير وحرية الصحافة والإعلام وبين احترام الخصوصية الثقافية للمجتمعات والخصوصية الدينية؟ شكرا.
أكيد سؤال صعب، لكن نقطتين مقبول ينحط أو ينوضع كمناصرين لحرية التعبير قيود وحدود لحرية التعبير بحالتين. الحالة الأولى هي الدعوة للكراهية، دعوة المباشرة للقيام بأعمال يعاقب عليها القانون بشكل عنيف، يعني مثلا دعوة للقتل، دعوة لبغض واضطهاد فئة معينة من المجتمع، يعني ويجب أنه يكون في رابط، أنه إذا مثلا وسيلة إعلامية صغيرة جدا وإلها تأثير ضعيف جدا قامت بالدعوة للقتل ودعوة للكراهية لا تعاقب بنفس الطريقة مثل ما مؤسسة إعلامية ضخمة إلى ملايين وملايين المشاهدين أو المتابعين قامت بالدعوة نفسها. يعني حتى بموضوع القيود لازم تكون مناسبة مع حجم الفعل. والقيد الثاني هو موضوع حريتي تتوقف حين تبدأ حرية الآخر مش معتقد الآخر وهيدا موضوع نحن منحارب ضده.
Sorry, I just remembered. You need to speak in English so that the English speakers can get the translation.
Okay.
Is that okay?
So I'll quickly shift to English. So we said that there are two limitations that are widely accepted in our community as media freedom defenders, two limitations to freedom of expression. The first limitation is call for hate speech, call for murder, call for discrimination. And at the same time, even in this case, the kind of punishment for those who conduct such calls need to be proportionate to the message and to the influence of the messenger. So you do not have the same kind of, it's not the same consequence if an unknown blogger with 5 followers says something, or if someone who has 50 million followers call for hate. I mean, it's not the same equivalence. And the second limitation is the fact that my freedom stops when someone else's freedom starts, not when someone else's beliefs start. And this is, I know, a controversial element in the Arab world, but we're really strongly defending it. If I prevent someone from another faith, from another tradition, from living their faith, living their tradition, implementing the way they live, if I prevent them, then we can consider this a violation of their freedom. But if I don't respect what they believe in and say it out loud, I'm not preventing them from continuing to believe what they believe in and say what they believe in. So I will not accept that anyone would put limitation on saying, I do not respect your beliefs. I have the right to say it, I do not respect your belief, or your beliefs belong to a tradition that I think is against women's rights. Saying this is not a crime. Don't ever come to me and say, you're not respecting my tradition. Well, I'm not respecting your tradition, but I'm allowing you to continue and use it. And I will defend your right to continue to live your tradition, but don't tell me, don't say what you believe in.
Thanks. Thanks, Ayman. And this is something, Emmanuelle, you referred to when you said, although we draw the line at hate speech, right? And I know there are different legal traditions between the US, UK, Canada,
and the EU,
and the EU and Lebanon when it comes to that. Do you mind addressing that point? Where do we draw that line exactly? I mean, I don't know if we can give some examples when it comes to stopping this freedom of expression from going into hate speech.
So, I'm not a legal expert, of course, but I mean, a lot of it in Canada is based on common law. So it is successive decisions, made by judges. But I'm very thankful, I must say, that Canadian judges have used a very narrow definition of hate speech. So you basically have to incite hatred actively in order to be, held criminally responsible for, or to have your freedom of speech curtailed. And that basically means inciting violence, murder, against a specific community. Of course, that should not be tolerated, and it is difficult to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate it in a court, to basically taking excerpts of articles or of, sometimes we see it a lot on talk radio in Canada, where you have some specific, I don't know if I would call them journalists, but hosts, radio hosts, who really target a specific community and day after day incite hatred, destruction of lieux de prière, and that, in those cases, I think we should be able to take action, absolutely, because again, the objective of free speech, I mean, it's a right, of course, and it's an objective in itself, but the objective of free speech is to provide citizens with information to contribute actively and in a well-informed way in their society. So, a discourse that actively encourages violence towards a specific group does not do that at all. It does the opposite.
Thank you.
And can I just
Sure.
on this, because this is an important question, and I think it's something that many states and societies are still coming to terms with, obviously. And just as a kind of couple of examples, there is a distinction between, and again, we're trying to kind of work our way through this, so the person who actually films and says the incitement to murder, let's use an example, that is obviously the wrong side of the line. What about the social media platform that hosts it? And certainly we believe that social media platforms should be doing more to restrict the use of their platforms to put some of that stuff on. What about the journalist who then reports on it and who has to download it in order to be able to see it, in order to be able to report on it? And I think most people think that falls on the right side of the line. But exactly where do you draw this line here, and particularly when it comes to the social media platform itself, and what obligations, it comes to Emmanuelle's point earlier about the duties, where does their duty start and end? And that's not really what we're talking about, I think, with regard to the journalists and the practitioners themselves, but it's very relevant, and Ayman will be the expert on this. There will definitely be some states who will be more draconian on that, including for those who are reporting, than others.
Okay, we have about time for 2 more questions, maybe. Let's have our colleague there.
مساء الخير، إبراهيم من الأردن. أنا يعني السؤال لمن يرغب الإجابة، لكن بالنسبة للحريات أو يعني مساحة الحرية في التعبير في الأوطان العربية بالذات، يعني أعتقد إنه في عندنا تخبط في التشريعات. يعني مثلا في الأردن عندنا الصحفي ما بيعرف إيش بيتحاسب، هو قانون نقابة الصحفيين أو قانون المطبوعات والنشر ولا الجرائم الإلكترونية ولا حتى قانون العقوبات. فالتخبط بالتشريعات هذا بيؤدي لمشكلة كبيرة في مجتمعاتنا العربية، بالتالي بيؤدي لتراجع مساحة الحريات. لكن السؤال للجهات المانحة أو الدول المانحة، يعني لماذا لا يكون هناك إجراء حازم مع الدول التي تستفيد من أموالكم لكن لا تقدم أو لا تقدم أو تغيير في مجال الحريات، وخاصة أنكم تستطيعون معرفة وضع هذه الدول من خلال المناقشات الدورية لتقارير حقوق الإنسان. شكرا.
So let me translate that very quickly, and I hope I'm doing a good job, like our professional translators in the back. He was talking about the contradictory laws in the Arab world about freedom of expression and press freedoms. And that's actually the case in Lebanon too, where
Jordan, Kuwait, everywhere.
Exactly. A journalist does not know, or even a blogger does not know which law he or she are being judged upon. Civil law, criminal law, you name it. There's a laundry list of laws. Our colleague is asking, why don't the governments who fund media development actually crack down on these countries and not give them funding, if I'm not mistaken by
fund media development, but also fund our governments, provide them with software. And
yes.
Why can't you be stronger, harsher on our governments when they do not comply with the levels of freedom of expression we all believe in?
Yeah. We're both asking and him now.
Echoing.
Fine. I mean, look, state-to-state relations are complicated, okay? And we spend a lot of money in this country, just as the UK, and plenty of other of our donors spend a lot of money here, as we do in Jordan and elsewhere. And there is a form of conditionality attached to almost all of that in its own way. We do not provide direct support in this space. We tend to do it through organizations like yours and elsewhere, and I think that continues to be the right kind of thing to do. But the big strategic questions about how much money we should put into education in Lebanon or in Jordan or other things are taken on the basis not of, I think, specific questions to do with, for example, what's the freedom of expression situation here, but what direction of travel is this country going in? And that will form a part of that consideration. There are a lot of issues out there that I would like to see more progress on in this country, and this is one of them, despite what people have been saying already. And we'll look at ways to do that. Sometimes using your cash checkbook is a really good way of doing it. Sometimes actually it's a really bad way, because the hosts will say, and I'm not thinking of any particular country, but the hosts will say, well, in that case, you can take your money away. That's absolutely fine. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't help the people. So it's complicated.
Support for our security institutions, if I may, whether the Army, the General Securities, ISF, I know how much you're involved in supporting community policing and border. So 2 institutions that very often appear in our reports as wrongdoers. What kind of conversations do you have with them?
Well, if I may, diplomacy is about engagement, right? So, I mean, sometimes cutting the channels and, it can seem appealing and very righteous, but, in very few cases is it the right option. We much prefer, as
Dialogue.
Chris said, working with civil society, keeping the conversation going with, various government institutions, because once the door is closed, you have no influence.
Absolutely.
It's basically, it might feel good at the moment, and you might feel and then what do you do? What do you do then? So yes, of course, we discuss those things. We discuss a variety of human rights issues, in all countries, not just here in Lebanon, in all countries where we're present. And when we see some goodwill, of course, we try to provide technical, and there's a request for technical support, for advice. We definitely try to do that. And when there's a case of concern, when we see, a specific case that is of concern, do we raise those? Of course we do. The answer is yes, we do. I mean, I won't get into details, but that's a part of the work we do, and certainly the initiative of the conference in July is part of that. It's bringing a host of governments, around the table, not all of which have the same approach to freedom of expression and freedom of the press, and talking about it.
And also people like you.
Yeah,
exactly.
of course, and exactly with civil society organizations and journalists, and say, okay, how do we take a step forward?
Thank you. One more question. تفضلي.
سؤالي التربية الإعلامية بين الواقع والمأمول. التربية
مأمول.
والمأمول. الآن الواقع بالنسبة لنظري وسائل الإعلام من يملكها؟ هل يملكها الواقع البشري والسياسي؟ يعني الواقع يعني أصحاب القرار، أصحاب السلطة، والواقع المادي وأصحاب النظريات، وكيف يمكن التخلص نحو المأمول من هذه التي أعتبرها الثالوث الصعب.
I think that question is for you, Ayman. In English, please.
Kifina, how can we build media ownership that is more open, more transparent, more democratic? I think I know I have a big ego, but I'm still modest enough to know I cannot have an answer to this question.
He's working on it.
Yeah, but let's not focus on the big ones, because the big media outlets right now are very difficult to reform when it comes to their ownership, at least in our region. But there is a beautiful alternative media scene that is emerging, mainly online, and we know that because of the algorithms, it's not necessarily reaching the audience it deserves, but there are so many small ones and that are bigger today and that are still growing that deserve our support. Of course, receiving funding, but also liaising them with the best tech minds, with the best investors in order to increase their reach. I will give you some examples, and it's not about promotion. In Lebanon, thinking about Daraj, As-Safir al-Arabi, Megaphone, Rasif 22, Hibr in Jordan, Mada Masr in Egypt, Intifada in Tunisia, Al-Alam al-Jadid in Iraq specifically for some types of projects, Al-Jumhuriyya in Syria, Anab Baladi, Syria Untold. These are initiatives that are about journalism, independent, high-quality journalism. Our role is to tell them when they are doing well, doing wrong, but to support them, because instead of focusing on the traditional media that is so much linked to the political and economic interest, there is today a real platform of new, upcoming, independent media outlets that we can all support.
Add something. Fully agree. I just want to say, independent media, wonderful, but I just again want to emphasize the importance of reading the other stuff as well.
Yes, absolutely.
The yellow press, the populist, because all media in the end represent people. They may not be people you agree with, they may not be people you like, but once in a while, when I read media that I generally disagree with, I'll find a nugget of information that I couldn't find in the independent media that I prefer, or in the mainstream media that I prefer to rely upon for my information. And I think it's important, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum and what your beliefs are, to continue following the advice of my dear professor and read everything. To the extent it's possible these days.
And I just wanted to add, because I think it's relevant to this, in this world of kind of distorted truths and all of that, don't get sucked into it. So I think if you like, this is the message for for any students, which is we may be going through a difficult period with this, but the most important thing is to remain trusted. And I'm a kind of believer that we will find a way for people to find, and we don't have it at the moment, for more people to find what is trusted that they want to be reading. And there will be at some point there will be some kind of revolution that will help us to do that. So the best way to set out and to drive a successful career in this space is not to be sucked into the exaggeration and in the basically falsehoods. It is to those core kind of journalistic skills, which are sourcing, finding stories that other people don't know, relying on truth, and you will find that that ultimately is popular and will make a successful career.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask you in the last 3 minutes to take just 1 minute and give advice. You have roughly 70, 75 academics, journalists, and activists, and journalism students in the room. What advice do you give them to go back to their countries, to their communities, and spread media literacy, media freedoms, and advance social justice? I know you already answered part of it, but since you were the last one to speak, why don't we start with you, Chris?
Okay. Well, I kind of gave my one. The other thing is to seek inspiration. So whatever field you're in, I think it's the same. Find examples of people who basically you love their stories. And in this particular field, there are loads of them. One or two of them are slightly flawed as individuals, but what they have achieved in success as fantastic journalists who've uncovered enormously skillful things over the years. I think of some of the examples, really simple things from the UK, but they've really changed life. So the expenses scandal in the British Parliament, what was it, in the 1960s, when the Minister of War had to resign because he had been with a prostitute who was also with the Russian ambassador. I mean, some of these examples of fantastic, investigative, challenging, constructive journalism. Find your examples, be they Marie Colvin or Elise Doucette or whoever it is, and let them inspire you.
Emmanuelle?
I don't know if I would dare giving advice to journalists. I mean, I think your work is extremely important. I just want to say that as a citizen and as an ambassador, I really appreciate everything you're doing. I know that it incurs some dangers at times, so stay safe would be a piece of advice, maybe. And other than that, information is power, so don't share it. No. Information is power. So it's true, some people actually behave like that. And your job, and that's probably the beauty of it, is that your job is actually to share it, and therefore to share the power. So, you know, when you have power, use it well, be mindful of it, and yeah, as I said, stay safe, because powerful people tend to be in the spotlight a little more. Yeah, thank you.
Let's also not forget our parents. When it comes to media information literacy, it seems that we're maybe doing slightly better now with younger generations, but in fact, the ones who most often fall victims of disinformation is my parents' generation. So I think we haven't been creative enough in finding ways to address that element when it comes to social media and spread of disinformation. I think this is something that your lab can probably think about, media information literacy for relatively older people.
Thank you very much.
You mean people like me?
No, much older, much older.
I think they deserve an applause and thanks.